What if I told you our world map is all wrong? Not the geography, of course, but the way we've divided it up, socially and economically. Okay, let's dive into this really fascinating idea from a 1979 text that proposed a radical new way to organize society, not based on old history or politics, but on the real-world problems people are actually facing.
So the source material kicks things off with this powerful analogy. Just like giant creatures of the past couldn't adapt and went extinct, this theory argues that small, separate states are struggling to survive in our modern world. It's a pretty dramatic way to set the stage, right? It's saying our global structure is failing to keep up. So what's the big problem it's trying to solve?
Well, the first part of the argument is that our current political boundaries, they're just fundamentally out of date. And the text really ties this into what we now call globalization. The idea is that science and technology are just bulldozing old barriers and dogmas, pushing all of us toward having common interests. The friction, it argues, comes from trying to solve 21st century problems with, 19th century maps.
Okay, so if small states are the problem, what's the solution? This is where the text introduces a brand new concept, the socio-economic unit.
And you got to notice the two-part goal here. On one hand, it's all about solving local problems to create these self-sufficient, prosperous regions. But, and this is key, it's always with the long-term goal of uniting all of humanity. It's like a bottoms-up approach to building a truly global society.
Now, this slide gets into a really core philosophy of the whole theory. It makes this super sharp distinction about what freedom means. So, in the material world, finite stuff like land and money, it argues we need limits to stop exploitation. But in the internal worlds of our minds and spirits, freedom should be totally absolute, because one person's intellectual or spiritual growth doesn't take anything away from someone else's.
So how would you actually build one of these units? Well, the text doesn't just leave it at theory. It proposes a surprisingly specific 5-point blueprint that serves as the foundation for the whole thing.
Here they are, the 5 core criteria. And you'll notice something right away. The blueprint puts the practical, on-the-ground reality of people's lives, their shared economic challenges, ahead of everything else. Let's break each one down.
First up, and this is the big one, is shared problems. The idea is to group people together who are all facing the same economic hurdles. So forget the old state lines. If your region and the one next door both struggle with water shortages, you belong in the same unit. Why? Because you're both trying to solve the exact same core problem.
Building on that, the second point is all about fairness and potential. A unit has to have a pretty consistent economic landscape so that one part isn't, vastly richer or more resource-heavy than another. The goal here is to create a level playing field for everyone inside the unit.
Okay, so after you've set the economic base, the theory turns to culture. And this one is handled very, very carefully. It is not about creating monoethnic states. Far from it. The goal is actually to protect and empower all ethnic groups so they can develop freely and blend together, not out of fear or weakness, but from a place of mutual respect, what the source beautifully calls a multicolored garland of humanity.
This criterion basically acknowledges that we're sentimental beings. A shared history, a common language, a similar culture, that all creates a powerful psychological bond, that sense of us. These shared feelings are seen as the social glue holding the unit together, as long as they don't turn into us versus them thinking.
And finally, we get to the physical geography, which, just makes sense. It's practical to group areas that have similar land and resources. A mountain region has totally different needs than a coastal plain, right? So their economic units should reflect that reality. So there you have it. Those 5 criteria are the blueprint for one unit.
Okay, so we have the blueprint for the building blocks. But how do these individual units lead to a unified world? Well, the text lays out a very clear progression.
This slide gives us some really concrete examples from the source of why this is even needed. Look at Bihar, for example. One part has way too little water, while another part has way too much. According to this theory, forcing them into one political unit means neither problem gets solved effectively. They should be 2 different socioeconomic units, each one focused on its unique challenge. And here's the grand vision. First, you build these strong, self-sufficient local units. Then, as neighboring units get their act together and become prosperous, they naturally start to merge. It's seen as this organic process that just keeps expanding outward until, eventually, you've got a single, integrated global society with a world government.
Of course, anytime you create a new system of power, you open the door for new kinds of corruption.
The text actually anticipates this, and it builds in several safeguards to stop the system from turning on itself.
So the key insight here is that the system can't just be about economics. It has to have a moral and philosophical core. It needs a universal humanist ideology, a spiritual foundation to fight prejudice, a class of moral leaders to act as a check on power, and strong, fair global institutions. This quote right here, it really sums up the whole ethical foundation. Leadership isn't about getting power or wealth. It's this dual path of personal, spiritual growth combined with selfless service to everyone else. That's the proposed guardrail against tyranny.
And that brings us to the end. This idea from 1979 is a really profound challenge to how we see the world. It asks us to look past the map we all know and imagine a new one based on shared challenges and shared potential. What would it actually look like if we drew borders around climate zones or watersheds or economic needs instead of old battle lines? That's a pretty fascinating question to think about.